The cockpit alarm screamed through the thin mountain air as Captain Elena Vasquez watched her co-pilot's hands freeze on the controls. Below them, the jagged peaks of the Andes stretched endlessly, while above, a wall of storm clouds pressed down like a closing fist. In the passenger cabin behind them, 180 souls trusted their lives to a crew that was about to discover just how fragile that trust could be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pull up, pull up! The ground proximity warning system shrieked its mechanical warning, but Captain Rodriguez's hands remained locked in position, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes when years of training suddenly prove inadequate against the raw power of nature. Elena reached for the controls, her fingers barely grazing the yoke before Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Don't touch anything, Vasquez. I've got this." But he didn't have it. And in the next 60 seconds, Elena would have to choose between following orders and saving everyone on board. The morning had started like any other at Jorge Chavez International Airport in Lima, Peru. The pre-dawn darkness was pierced by the orange glow of runway lights, as crews prepared for the day's first departures. Elena stood in the crew briefing room, her crisp white uniform bearing the 4 stripes of a first officer, though her experience told a different story than her rank suggested. At 34, Elena had logged over 8,000 flight hours across some of the most challenging airspace in South America. She had navigated through Amazon thunderstorms that could tear an aircraft apart, landed on remote jungle strips where the margin for error was measured in inches, and flown humanitarian missions into areas where most commercial pilots wouldn't dare venture. Yet here she stood, still wearing the 3 stripes of a first officer, while pilots half her age commanded their own aircraft. The reason was simple and frustrating. Elena's background wasn't traditional airline material. She had learned to fly in the Peruvian Air Force, where her instructors were old-school pilots who believed in understanding every rivet and wire of their aircraft. They taught her to fly by feel as much as by instruments, to read the subtle signs that modern automation often missed. But civilian aviation had moved beyond such antiquated methods, or so the airline executives believed. Captain Miguel Rodriguez entered the briefing room with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. At 48, he was everything the airline wanted in a captain: polished, well-connected, and thoroughly versed in modern flight management systems. His uniform was immaculate, his logbooks impressive, and his flight safety record unblemished. What he lacked was the kind of experience that couldn't be learned in simulators. Rodriguez had spent most of his career flying the airline's easy routes between major cities, where sophisticated airports and advanced air traffic control systems made flying feel almost routine. The challenging mountain routes, the unpredictable weather patterns of the Andes, the thin air that could turn a simple approach into a life-or-death struggle. These were territories he had only recently begun to explore as he was assigned more prestigious international flights. Elena watched as Rodriguez reviewed the flight plan for their route to Quito, Ecuador. The path would take them over some of the most treacherous terrain in the world, through mountain passes where downdrafts could slam an aircraft into the ground with terrifying speed. She had flown this route dozens of times, knew every peak and valley, every weather pattern that could turn deadly without warning. The meteorological briefing painted a concerning picture. A massive storm system was building over the mountains, with severe turbulence and possible icing conditions reported along their planned route. The weather officer, a veteran of mountain flying himself, suggested considering an alternate path that would add 40 minutes to their flight time but avoid the worst of the conditions. Rodriguez dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "We've got one of the most advanced aircraft in the sky," he said, tapping the flight plan with confidence. "The autopilot can handle a little rough weather. We'll stick to the scheduled route." Elena felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She had seen this attitude before, the dangerous overconfidence that came from relying too heavily on technology without understanding its limitations. In the mountains, automation was a tool, not a crutch. When conditions turned extreme, it often came down to pilot skill and experience, qualities that couldn't be programmed into a computer. The aircraft they would be flying was indeed impressive. An Airbus A320 equipped with the latest fly-by-wire technology, advanced weather radar, and sophisticated autopilot systems. For most flights, these systems made flying safer and more efficient. But Elena knew that in the Andes, Where weather could change in minutes and terrain created unique challenges, even the most advanced technology had its limits. As they walked toward the aircraft, Elena attempted to share her concerns with Rodriguez. "Captain, I've flown this route in similar conditions. The weather radar doesn't always pick up mountain wave activity, and the turbulence reports are usually understated. Maybe we should consider." Rodriguez cut her off with a look that was both dismissive and slightly annoyed. "Vasquez, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I've been flying longer than you've been out of flight school. The company wouldn't have assigned me to this route if they didn't think I could handle it." The statement stung not just because of its condescension, but because of its fundamental inaccuracy. Elena had graduated from flight school over a decade ago, had flown in conditions that would terrify most airline pilots, and possessed knowledge of mountain flying that Rodriguez had never bothered to acquire. But expressing any of this would only reinforce his perception of her as an insubordinate first officer who didn't know her place. The passenger boarding process gave Elena time to study the weather updates more carefully. The storm system was intensifying faster than predicted, with wind speeds at altitude approaching dangerous levels. More concerning were the reports of severe downdrafts in the mountain passes, the kind of invisible air movements that could overwhelm an aircraft's ability to climb, no matter how powerful its engines. She approached Rodriguez one more time as he completed his pre-flight checks. "Captain, the latest weather shows deteriorating conditions. We might want to consider delaying departure or filing for the alternate route." This time, Rodriguez's response was sharper. "Vasquez, your job is to support my decisions, not question them. The weather is within operational limits, the aircraft is functioning perfectly, and we have a schedule to maintain. I don't need a first officer who's afraid of a little turbulence." The words hung in the air between them, creating a tension that would persist throughout the flight. Elena realized that any further suggestions would be interpreted as insubordination, regardless of their merit. She was trapped in a position where her experience and knowledge were unwelcome, where speaking up could be seen as overstepping her authority, but remaining silent might lead to disaster. The passengers boarded with the usual mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanied mountain flights. There were business travelers heading to meetings in Quito, families visiting relatives, and tourists eager to see the spectacular Andes from above. Among them sat Maria Santos, a grandmother traveling to see her new grandchild, and Carlos Mendez, a young engineer starting his first job abroad. They settled into their seats, trusting that the crew would deliver them safely to their destination, unaware of the brewing conflict in the cockpit or the dangerous conditions ahead. During the safety briefing, Elena found herself studying the passengers' faces. These people had placed their lives in the hands of the flight crew, confident that their pilots possessed the skill and judgment necessary to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. As they pushed back from the gate, Rodriguez engaged the autopilot almost immediately, a decision that concerned Elena but wasn't unusual for airline operations. Modern pilots were trained to rely heavily on automation, to trust that computers could handle most situations more reliably than human input. But Elena had learned in the Air Force that automation was a tool to be used judiciously, not a substitute for pilot skill and awareness. The takeoff was routine, the powerful engines lifting them smoothly into the pre-dawn sky. Lima fell away beneath them as they climbed toward their cruising altitude, the city's lights gradually giving way to the dark outline of the foothills. Ahead lay the Andes, their snow-capped peaks invisible in the darkness but present in Elena's mind like a three-dimensional map built from years of experience. As they approached the mountains, the first signs of trouble began to appear. The weather radar painted an ominous picture of precipitation and turbulence ahead, with areas of red and magenta indicating severe conditions. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through the radio with updates that grew more concerning by the minute. Avianca 247. Be advised, we're receiving reports of severe turbulence and mountain wave activity along your route. Several aircraft have requested deviations in the past hour. Suggest you consider alternate routing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Rodriguez keyed the radio with annoyance evident in his voice. Control, Avianca 247. We're equipped with the latest weather detection equipment. Request to continue on planned route. Elena watched the weather display with growing alarm. The storm system had intensified beyond the original forecasts, with wind speeds now exceeding the aircraft's design limits in some areas. More troubling were the gaps in radar coverage that she knew from experience could hide the most dangerous conditions. She tried once more to voice her concerns. "Captain, I've flown through these mountains in similar conditions. The radar doesn't show everything, and the wind patterns can be much worse than what we're seeing on our instruments." Rodriguez's response was swift and decisive. "Vasquez, I've made my decision. We continue as planned. And I want to make something clear. You are not to touch any controls without my explicit permission. Your job is to monitor instruments and follow my commands. Is that understood?" The message was unmistakably clear. Elena was being relegated to the role of a passive observer, her years of experience and mountain flying expertise dismissed as irrelevant. She was expected to sit quietly and watch, regardless of what her training and instincts told her about the dangers ahead. As they penetrated deeper into the mountains, the smooth ride began to deteriorate. The aircraft started encountering light turbulence, then moderate, the wings rocking as invisible air currents grabbed at the fuselage. Rodriguez maintained his confidence in the autopilot, but Elena could see the system was already working harder than normal to maintain their heading and altitude. The first real indication of serious trouble came as they approached a narrow pass between two towering peaks. Elena knew this area well. It was a notorious spot where mountain waves could create devastating downdrafts with little warning. The weather radar showed clear air ahead, but her experience told her that the most dangerous conditions were often invisible to electronic detection. She watched the instruments carefully, noting subtle changes in airspeed and altitude that indicated they were entering an area of severe atmospheric disturbance. The vertical speed indicator flickered, showing momentary descents that the autopilot quickly corrected. But Elena knew these were warning signs of much worse conditions ahead. The passengers were beginning to notice the rougher ride. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring seatbelts were fastened, their practiced smiles masking growing concern about the worsening conditions. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense, with Rodriguez gripping his armrests as the turbulence intensified, and Elena mentally preparing for scenarios that she hoped would never materialize. They were now flying through air that moved like an invisible ocean, with currents and waves that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated aircraft. The Andes were showing their power, demonstrating why they had earned a reputation as one of the most challenging mountain ranges in the world to fly over. And somewhere in the dark peaks ahead, conditions were building toward a perfect storm that would test every aspect of their training, judgment, and skill. Elena felt the aircraft shudder as they encountered the first major downdraft. The sensation was like dropping in a high-speed elevator, a stomach-lurching plunge that lasted several seconds before the autopilot managed to arrest their descent. She glanced at Rodriguez and saw sweat beading on his forehead despite the cockpit's air conditioning. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports from other aircraft. "Control, this is LATAM 503. We've encountered severe downdrafts at flight level 350, unable to maintain altitude, requesting immediate descent and diversion." Another voice joined the frequency. "Boliviano 112 reporting extreme turbulence and icing conditions. We've lost 2,000 feet in the last 2 minutes. Declaring emergency and diverting to nearest suitable airport." Elena felt her heart rate increase as she processed these reports. Experienced crews flying modern aircraft were declaring emergencies and abandoning their planned routes. The conditions were far worse than Rodriguez had anticipated, and they were flying directly into the heart of the storm system. She tried once more to reach her captain. "Miguel, we need to consider our options. The reports we're hearing suggest conditions worse than forecast. Maybe we should request vectors around the worst of it." Rodriguez's jaw was set in a hard line, his pride now invested in proving he could handle whatever the mountains threw at them. "We're fine, Vasquez. The aircraft is performing normally. A little turbulence never hurt anyone." But Elena could see that the aircraft was not performing normally. The autopilot was making increasingly aggressive corrections, the engine's cycling power as they fought to maintain speed and altitude. Most concerning was the subtle change in engine tone that indicated they were operating near their limits, struggling against atmospheric conditions that were pushing them toward their performance envelope. The storm struck with the sudden fury that Elena had learned to expect in the mountains. One moment they were flying through moderate turbulence. The next, they were caught in a maelstrom of wind and precipitation that seemed determined to tear their aircraft apart. The Airbus bucked and rolled like a wild horse, its sophisticated systems overwhelmed by forces that exceeded their design parameters. Rodriguez's confidence evaporated as quickly as the visibility outside their windscreen. Ice began forming on the wings, degrading their lift and increasing their weight. The engine strained against headwinds that fluctuated between calm air and hurricane-force gusts. Most dangerous of all, they were caught in a massive downdraft that was pushing them toward the invisible peaks below. The first indication that they were in serious trouble came from the ground proximity warning system. The automated voice began its ominous chant, "Terrain! Terrain! Pull up! Pull up!" Elena watched in horror as their altitude unwound rapidly on the instruments. They were losing height at a rate that would soon become irreversible, falling toward mountains that were invisible in the storm but deadly in their proximity. The autopilot was fighting valiantly, but losing the battle against atmospheric forces that no computer could fully comprehend. Rodriguez's hands flew to the manual controls, finally recognizing that automation alone would not save them. But his movements were hesitant, uncertain. He had spent so many years relying on computerized systems that the transition to hand flying in extreme conditions was like switching from a familiar language to a foreign tongue under pressure. Elena could see what needed to be done. Her years of mountain flying had taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated escape routes from downdrafts. She knew the engine management techniques that could squeeze maximum performance from the aircraft. Most importantly, she understood the terrain below them well enough to navigate toward areas where the atmospheric conditions might be less severe. But Rodriguez's earlier command echoed in her mind. She was not to touch the controls without explicit permission. Even as their situation grew more desperate, even as the ground proximity warnings became more urgent, she was expected to remain a passive observer, while her captain struggled with conditions beyond his experience. The aircraft continued its terrifying descent, now approaching altitudes that brought them dangerously close to the highest peaks. Elena could feel the airframe straining against forces that threatened to exceed its structural limits. In the passenger cabin, people were praying, crying, and preparing for what many believed would be their final moments. Through the chaos and fear, one thought burned in Elena's mind with crystal clarity. She had the knowledge and skill to save everyone on board, but protocol demanded she remain silent and motionless while disaster approached. The weight of 180 lives pressed against her conscience like a physical force, demanding that she choose between following orders and following her duty to preserve human life. The moment of decision was fast approaching, and Elena Vasquez would have to decide whether being right was worth being insubordinate, whether saving lives was worth risking her career. In the next few minutes, she would discover that sometimes the most important rules were the ones you had to break. The altimeter was spinning backward like a broken clock, each foot of lost altitude bringing them closer to an invisible death among the peaks. Elena watched the numbers with the detached precision of someone trained to function under extreme stress, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. 12,000 feet, 11,000, 10,500. The mathematics of their descent were brutally simple. At this rate, they had perhaps 90 seconds before the Andes claimed another aircraft. Rodriguez's hands trembled on the controls as he pulled back on the yoke with increasing desperation. The aircraft's nose rose in response, but the downdraft was relentless, an invisible fist shoving them toward the rocks with a force that seemed almost personal. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cockpit's climate control, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Elena's training kicked in with the automatic precision of a machine. Her eyes swept the instrument panel, processing information faster than conscious thought could follow. Engine parameters, airspeed, attitude indicators, weather radar. Each gauge told part of a story that she understood, with an intimacy born from thousands of hours in similar conditions. The complete picture was terrifying but not hopeless, provided someone with the right knowledge took action. The wind shear was classic for this part of the Andes, a rotating cylinder of air that formed when high-altitude winds encountered the mountain barriers. Elena had encountered this phenomenon before, had learned to read its subtle signatures and navigate through its deadly embrace. But Rodriguez was fighting it like an enemy, rather than working with it like the natural force it was. His technique was textbook perfect for normal conditions, but catastrophically wrong for their current situation. He was trying to climb directly through the downdraft using maximum power, a strategy that would work in clear air but was doomed to failure in the violent atmospheric river that had captured them. The engines were screaming at full throttle, consuming fuel at an alarming rate while producing insufficient lift to overcome the massive column of descending air. Elena could see the solution as clearly as if it were written on the instruments before her. They needed to turn 30 degrees left and descend slightly, trading altitude for airspeed, while angling toward a gap between the peaks where the downdraft would be less severe. Then, once clear of the worst conditions, they could use the aircraft's momentum and the natural updraft on the lee side of the mountain to regain their lost altitude. But explaining this to Rodriguez would take precious seconds they didn't have, and implementing it would require her to take control of an aircraft that he had explicitly forbidden her to touch. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity: follow protocol and watch 180 people die, or violate direct orders and save everyone on board. The ground proximity warning system had escalated to its most urgent level, the synthetic voice now screaming continuously, "Pull up, pull up, pull up." The sound filled the cockpit like an electronic banshee, drowning out normal communication and adding to the psychological pressure that was clearly overwhelming Rodriguez. Elena made her decision with the same calm precision that had characterized her entire military career. She reached across the center console and placed her hands firmly on the flight controls, her touch light but authoritative. Rodriguez felt the pressure immediately and turned toward her with shock and fury written across his sweat-streaked face. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted over the cacophony of alarms. "Get your hands off my controls!" But Elena was already implementing her plan, her movements smooth and decisive despite the aircraft's violent motion. She reduced power slightly and pushed the nose down, trading their rapidly decreasing altitude for desperately needed airspeed. The maneuver felt wrong to anyone trained in conventional emergency procedures, but Elena knew it was their only hope. Rodriguez tried to fight her inputs, pulling back on his yoke while she pushed forward on hers. The result was a sickening oscillation that threatened to stall the aircraft completely. Elena's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Miguel, let me fly. I know these mountains." "You're going to kill us all!" Rodriguez screamed back, his training and pride warring with the evidence of his own inadequacy. "We need to climb, not descend." The aircraft shuddered as their conflicting inputs created a dangerous pilot-induced oscillation. Elena realized that Rodriguez's panic had made him incapable of rational decision-making, his fear overriding years of training. She would have to be more assertive if she wanted to save their lives. With a movement born from countless hours of emergency training, Elena's left hand found the captain's side stick and firmly but gently moved it to neutral. Her right hand took positive control of her own stick, establishing clear command authority over the aircraft's flight path. Rodriguez's eyes went wide with shock at her boldness, but the immediate improvement in the aircraft's behavior was undeniable. Elena's experience took over completely now. She had flown through similar conditions dozens of times, had felt the unique signature of Andean mountain waves and learned to work with them rather than against them. Her hands moved with practiced precision, making small control inputs that gradually brought the aircraft's wild gyrations under control. The turn to the left was shallow but deliberate, angling them away from the worst of the downdraft while maintaining enough forward speed to keep the aircraft controllable. Elena's eyes swept constantly between the instruments and the weather radar, reading the invisible landscape of air currents with the skill of someone who had made such navigation an art form. "What are you doing?" Rodriguez demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier hysteria as he began to notice that their descent rate was slowing. "Working with the mountain instead of fighting it," Elena replied through gritted teeth, her concentration absolute. She could feel the aircraft responding to her inputs, the violent shaking beginning to subside as they moved away from the core of the downdraft. The weather radar showed what Elena had expected: a gap in the atmospheric violence ahead and to their left, an area where the mountain's geography created a brief respite from the storm's fury. If she could maneuver them into that zone, they would have a chance to regain altitude and escape the trap that had nearly claimed their lives. But the maneuver required precise timing and absolute trust in her reading of conditions that were invisible to normal instruments. A mistake now would send them into terrain with no possibility of recovery. Elena felt the weight of 180 lives in her hands, each passenger's trust transformed into a physical pressure that threatened to overwhelm her focus. The aircraft's attitude began to stabilize as they approached the edge of the downdraft. Elena could feel the change in the air around them. the subtle shift in pressure and turbulence that indicated they were moving into less hostile atmospheric territory. Her experience was being validated with each passing second, but they were still dangerously low and running out of room for error. Rodriguez had fallen silent, his hands hovering near his controls but no longer fighting her inputs. His training was beginning to overcome his panic, and he was starting to recognize that Elena's unconventional technique was actually working. The altimeter had stopped its terrifying backward spin and was beginning to show the first hints of stabilization. Elena's next move required even more courage than her initial takeover of the controls. She needed to descend further, trading precious altitude for the airspeed that would allow them to penetrate the atmospheric barrier ahead. Every instinct Rodriguez possessed would scream against this maneuver, and she knew he might try to override her again. "Miguel, I need you to trust me for the next 30 seconds, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "We're going to descend another 500 feet, but it's going to save us." "That's insane," Rodriguez protested. "We're already too low." But Elena was already pushing the nose down slightly, her eyes fixed on the weather radar display. She could see the gap approaching, a narrow corridor between walls of atmospheric violence that would allow them to escape their predicament. The maneuver required split-second timing and absolute precision, but it was their only hope. The aircraft accelerated as they descended, trading altitude for the kinetic energy they would need to climb once they reached the safer air ahead. Elena's hands moved constantly on the controls, making tiny adjustments to keep them aligned with the narrow escape route she had identified. The passengers in the cabin were experiencing the ride of their lives, pressed into their seats by forces that seemed determined to shake the aircraft apart. Flight attendants braced themselves in galleys and jump seats, their professional training the only thing preventing complete panic among the terrified travelers. Maria Santos, the grandmother traveling to meet her new grandchild, clutched her rosary with arthritic fingers and prayed in Spanish for deliverance. Carlos Mendez, the young engineer, stared out the window into the black storm and wondered if he would ever see another sunrise. Throughout the cabin, 178 other people faced their mortality with varying degrees of courage and fear, united only in their complete dependence on the skills of their flight crew. In the cockpit, Elena felt the aircraft respond to her inputs with increasing smoothness. They were approaching the gap she had identified, the narrow corridor of less violent air that would allow them to begin their escape from the mountain's deadly embrace. Her timing had to be perfect. Too early and they would miss the opportunity entirely. Too late and they would be past the point of no return. The moment arrived with the subtle shift in turbulence that Elena had been waiting for. She pulled back gently on the controls, converting their airspeed into precious altitude while angling toward the updraft that she knew waited on the lee side of the nearby peak. The aircraft responded like a living thing, eager to climb after its terrifying descent toward the rocks. Rodriguez watched in amazement as their vertical speed indicator swung from negative to positive, showing a climb rate that had seemed impossible just moments before. The ground proximity warnings began to subside as they gained altitude, moving away from the invisible peaks that had nearly claimed their lives. Elena's technique was textbook perfect for mountain flying, but it was a textbook that Rodriguez had never studied. She was using the mountain's own atmospheric dynamics against it, working with the natural flow of air rather than trying to overwhelm it with brute force. Her years of experience in the Peruvian Air Force were paying dividends that no amount of simulator training could have provided. As they climbed through safer altitudes, Elena began to relax slightly, though her hands remained firm on the controls. They were not yet clear of danger. The storm system still surrounded them, and they would need to navigate carefully to avoid similar encounters with mountain wave activity. But the immediate threat of controlled flight into terrain had passed, thanks to her willingness to violate protocol and take control when it mattered most. Rodriguez sat in stunned silence, his earlier anger replaced by a mixture of gratitude and professional embarrassment. He had nearly killed everyone on board through his stubborn refusal to acknowledge the limitations of his experience. Elena's intervention had saved not only 180 lives, but also his career and reputation. The radio crackled with urgent calls from air traffic control, who had been tracking their emergency descent with growing alarm. Other aircraft in the area had declared emergencies and diverted to alternate airports, but somehow Avianca 247 had managed to recover from what appeared to be an impossible situation. Avianca 247, Lima Control. We show you climbing through flight level 200. Please advise your status and intentions. Elena keyed the radio, her voice professionally calm despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Lima Control, Avianca 247. We encountered severe mountain wave activity and temporary altitude loss. Currently climbing to flight level 350 and request vectors around the weather ahead. Roger, 247. Turn right heading 09-0 for weather avoidance. We have reports of continuing severe conditions along your original route. Are you declaring an emergency? Elena glanced at Rodriguez, who was still staring at the instruments in disbelief. She made the decision to maintain their schedule if possible, knowing that declaring an emergency would trigger investigations and reports that might complicate the situation unnecessarily. Control, 247. Negative on the emergency. We're stable at this time and request direct routing to Quito when conditions permit. As they flew around the worst of the storm system, Elena gradually transferred control back to Rodriguez. The gesture was diplomatic, allowing him to save face while acknowledging her superior knowledge of mountain flying conditions. He accepted the return of authority with visible relief, though his hands were noticeably less steady than they had been before their encounter with the mountain. The remainder of the flight passed without incident, the aircraft performing flawlessly once they were clear of the atmospheric violence that had nearly destroyed them. Elena remained alert and ready to intervene again if necessary, but Rodriguez seemed to have learned a valuable lesson about the limits of his expertise and the dangers of overconfidence. As they began their descent into Quito, Rodriguez finally broke the silence that had dominated the cockpit since their near disaster. His voice was quiet, stripped of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier communications. Elena, he said, using her first name for the first time during their association. I owe you an apology. And probably my life. Elena nodded acknowledgement, but didn't respond immediately. She was still processing the magnitude of what had occurred, the split-second decision that had saved everyone on board. The violation of protocol was a serious matter that could have consequences for her career, but she knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. I should have listened to you about the weather, Rodriguez continued. I should have taken your experience seriously instead of dismissing it. How did you know what to do back there? Elena's answer was simple but profound. I knew the mountains, Miguel. I've flown through these conditions before. Learned to read the signs that the instruments can't show. When the computers fail, you need to understand the fundamentals of what makes an aircraft fly. The landing in Quito was smooth and unremarkable, a stark contrast to the drama they had experienced over the mountains. As they taxied to the gate, Elena felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that followed any successful emergency situation. They had cheated death through knowledge, skill, and the courage to act when action was necessary. The passengers deplaned with the grateful relief of people who had survived an experience they would remember for the rest of their lives. Most would never know how close they had come to disaster, or how the quick thinking of their first officer had saved them from becoming another tragic statistic in the long history of mountain flying accidents. Rodriguez completed the post-flight procedures with unusual thoroughness, his earlier casual attitude replaced by a newfound respect for the complexities of mountain aviation. He would never again dismiss weather reports so casually, never again assume that technology alone could overcome the raw power of nature. As they prepared to leave the aircraft, Rodriguez extended his hand to Elena with genuine gratitude. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Elena shook his hand, recognizing that their relationship had been fundamentally changed by the events over the mountains. She had proven her competence in the most dramatic way possible, but she also knew that the real test would come in how this experience was reported and remembered by their airline. The choice she had made to take control of the aircraft had saved lives, but it had also violated the most fundamental principle of airline operations, the captain's absolute authority over his aircraft. The consequences of that violation remained to be seen, and Elena understood that her act of heroism might also be viewed as an act of insubordination by those who valued protocol over results. As they walked through the terminal in Quito, Elena reflected on the strange paradox of her situation. She had prevented a catastrophic accident through superior knowledge and skill, but she had also committed a serious breach of protocol that could end her career. The next few days would determine whether her actions would be seen as heroic or insubordinate, whether saving 180 lives would be enough to justify defying a direct order from her captain. The mountains had tested them both and found Rodriguez wanting, but they had also revealed Elena's true capabilities in a way that no amount of training records or recommendations could have accomplished. She had proven herself under the most extreme conditions possible, demonstrating that her years of experience and unconventional background were assets rather than liabilities. But proving herself was only the first step in a longer journey. Now she would have to navigate the complex politics of airline operations, where being right wasn't always enough to protect someone who had violated the chain of command. The real test of Elena Vasquez was just beginning, and the stakes were nothing less than her future in aviation. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, piercing through Elena's sleep like an alarm bell. She had been back in Lima for 3 days, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened over the Andes, while waiting for the inevitable administrative response. The voice on the other end was crisp and official, belonging to Captain Sofia Herrera from the airline's Flight Operations Department. First Officer Vasquez, please report to headquarters at 900 hours today. Bring your logbooks and be prepared for a comprehensive debrief regarding Flight AV-247 to Quito. Elena dressed carefully in her most formal uniform, knowing that appearances would matter in whatever proceedings awaited her. The mirror reflected a woman who looked older than her 34 years, lines around her eyes that spoke of countless hours squinting into distant horizons and making split-second decisions under pressure. Today, those decisions would be scrutinized by people who had never faced the particular challenges that mountain flying demanded. The airline's headquarters occupied a gleaming modern building near Jorge Chavez Airport, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of corporate efficiency. Elena had visited the building many times for routine training and administrative matters, but today felt different. Today she was walking into a room where her career might live or die based on interpretations of regulations and protocols that had never been tested under the extreme conditions she had faced. Captain Herrera met her in the reception area, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating both aircraft and corporate hierarchies. Her expression was professionally neutral, giving no hint of whether Elena was walking into a commendation ceremony or a disciplinary hearing. First Officer Vasquez, she said with formal courtesy, thank you for coming. We have several people who need to speak with you about the Quito flight. The conference room was larger than Elena had expected, with a polished wooden table surrounded by chairs that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Already seated were 5 people whose titles and departments would determine the trajectory of Elena's future in aviation. At the head of the table sat Captain Luis Mendoza, the chief pilot, whose reputation for strict adherence to regulations was legendary throughout the airline. To his right was Dr. Patricia Vega, the company's chief safety officer, a former accident investigator whose analytical mind dissected every incident with surgical precision. Beside her sat Captain James Foster, an American pilot on loan from the airline's International Safety Committee, whose presence suggested that Elena's case had attracted attention beyond the normal channels. The remaining seats were occupied by representatives from the pilots' union and the airline's legal department, their presence confirming Elena's suspicion that this meeting would have consequences far beyond a simple debrief. She took the empty chair at the far end of the table, feeling like a defendant facing a tribunal rather than a pilot discussing an emergency situation. Captain Mendoza opened the proceedings with the measured tone of someone accustomed to conducting formal inquiries. First Officer Vasquez, we're here to discuss the events that occurred during Flight AV-247 on the 17th of this month. Our preliminary review has raised several questions about the actions taken during the emergency situation over the Andes. Elena straightened in her chair, drawing on the same composure that had served her during countless military briefings. Yes, sir. I'm prepared to answer any questions about the flight. Dr. Vega consulted a thick folder filled with documents and data printouts. According to the flight data recorder, there was a significant deviation from standard emergency procedures during the altitude loss incident. The captain was relieved of flight controls without a formal declaration of incapacity, and non-standard recovery techniques were employed. The words hung in the air like an indictment, reducing Elena's life-saving actions to clinical descriptions that stripped away all context and humanity. She had expected this approach, but still felt the sting of having her heroism reframed as misconduct. "Dr. Vega," Elena responded carefully, "the situation required immediate action. Captain Rodriguez was unable to execute the appropriate recovery technique for mountain wave conditions. My intervention prevented a controlled flight into terrain scenario." Captain Foster leaned forward, his accent carrying traces of Texas drawl. "First officer, I've reviewed mountain flying incidents for 15 years, and I've never seen recovery techniques like the ones you used. Where exactly did you learn to descend into a downdraft instead of climbing out of it?" This was the question Elena had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Her unconventional background was both her greatest asset and her most significant liability in the structured world of commercial aviation. She chose her words with extreme care. "Sir, I learned advanced mountain flying techniques during my service with the Peruvian Air Force. We operated in conditions where standard procedures were insufficient, and we developed methods for working with atmospheric phenomena rather than fighting against them." Captain Mendoza's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you suggesting that military techniques are superior to established civilian procedures?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that extreme conditions sometimes require adaptive techniques that aren't covered in standard training. The mountains don't follow the same rules as normal airspace." The Union representative, Captain Maria Rodriguez, spoke for the first time. "The issue isn't whether the techniques work, Elena. The issue is that you took control of an aircraft without the captain's permission. That's a fundamental violation of crew resource management principles." Elena felt the weight of institutional pressure bearing down on her, the collective force of an industry built on hierarchy and standardization. Every person in the room understood the importance of maintaining command structure, but none of them had been in that cockpit feeling the aircraft shake apart while death approached with mathematical certainty. "Captain Rodriguez," she replied, "crew resource management also includes the first officer's obligation to prevent unsafe acts by the captain. When Captain Rodriguez was unable to execute an effective recovery, I had a duty to intervene." Dr. Vega shuffled through her papers, finding the section she was looking for. "The data shows that Captain Rodriguez was following established procedures for altitude loss recovery. His technique was textbook correct according to current training standards." "His technique was correct for normal conditions," Elena countered, feeling her composure beginning to crack, "but we weren't in normal conditions. We were caught in a mountain wave downdraft that required specialized knowledge to escape. Textbook procedures would have killed everyone on board." The room fell silent as the implications of her statement settled over the assembled officials. Elena realized she had crossed a line from explaining her actions to criticizing established procedures, a move that could be interpreted as arrogance or insubordination by people invested in maintaining the current system. Captain Foster consulted his own notes, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "First Officer Vasquez, I've been flying mountains for 25 years, and I've never encountered conditions severe enough to require the kind of techniques you described. Are you certain that standard procedures wouldn't have been sufficient?" Elena met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of confidence built through years of successful flights in challenging conditions. "Sir, with respect, how many of those 25 years were spent flying single-engine aircraft through Andean storms at night? How many times have you had to land on jungle strips where the margin for error was measured in feet rather than miles?" The question wasn't meant to be disrespectful, but it highlighted the fundamental gap between Elena's experience and that of most commercial pilots. Her background was unique, forged in conditions that few civilian aviators would ever encounter. That uniqueness was either a valuable asset or a dangerous deviation from normal standards. Captain Mendoza intervened before the discussion could become more confrontational. "The question before us isn't the validity of various flying techniques. The question is whether proper procedures were followed during a critical emergency situation." He opened his own folder and extracted several official documents. "According to regulations, a first officer may assume control of an aircraft only under specific circumstances: declared captain incapacity, direct threat to flight safety with captain's acknowledgement, or formal emergency authority transfer." Elena knew the regulations as well as anyone in the room, had studied them during her transition from military to civilian aviation, but she also knew that regulations were written by committees in comfortable offices, not by pilots facing life-and-death situations in violent storms over hostile terrain. "Captain Mendoza," she said quietly, "there wasn't time for formal procedures." The ground proximity warning system was screaming. We were losing altitude at 800 feet per minute, and Captain Rodriguez was applying techniques that were making the situation worse. I had perhaps 30 seconds to act. The legal representative, a sharp-featured woman named Isabella Santos, spoke from her position at the side of the table. "Ms. Vasquez, the timeline is irrelevant to the regulatory question. Either proper procedures were followed or they weren't. The consequences of deviation, regardless of outcome, must be addressed." Elena felt the institutional machinery grinding toward a predetermined conclusion, the kind of bureaucratic inevitability that valued process over results. She had saved 180 lives through superior knowledge and courage, but the system seemed more concerned with the fact that she had colored outside the lines while doing it. Dr. Vega returned to her data analysis, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone discussing mechanical failures rather than human drama. "The flight data recorder shows clear evidence of conflicting control inputs during the critical phase. This created a dangerous oscillation that could have resulted in structural failure or complete loss of control. The oscillation occurred because Captain Rodriguez was fighting my inputs," Elena responded with growing frustration. "When I established positive control, the aircraft's behavior immediately stabilized. The data should show that clearly." Captain Foster nodded slowly, consulting his own analysis of the recorded information. "The data does show stabilization once unified control was established. The recovery profile, while unconventional, was ultimately successful." For the first time since the meeting began, Elena felt a glimmer of hope that someone in the room understood the technical realities of what had occurred. Captain Foster's experience with mountain flying gave him credibility that the others lacked, and his acknowledgement of her successful recovery carried significant weight. But Captain Mendoza remained focused on procedural compliance rather than technical effectiveness. Success doesn't negate the violation of established protocols. We can't have first officers taking control whenever they disagree with their captain's techniques. Elena straightened in her chair, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried her through the crisis over the mountains. "Sir, I didn't disagree with his techniques. His techniques were going to kill us. There's a difference between professional disagreement and preventing mass casualties." The union representative leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but her words cautionary. "Elena, everyone in this room understands that you acted with the best intentions. But we have to consider the precedent this sets. If first officers start overriding captains based on their personal assessment of situations, the entire command structure breaks down." Elena realized that she was facing a fundamental philosophical divide between individual judgment and institutional authority. The people in this room weren't necessarily wrong in their concerns about maintaining discipline and standardization, but they also weren't the ones who had felt the aircraft shaking apart while death approached with relentless certainty. Captain Foster set down his papers and looked directly at Elena, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "Let me ask you this, First Officer. If you found yourself in an identical situation tomorrow, would you take the same actions?" The question cut to the heart of everything Elena believed about aviation and responsibility. She could give the politically safe answer, expressing regret for any procedural violations while pledging to follow proper channels in the future. Or she could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. Elena met his gaze without wavering. "Yes, sir, I would. If I have knowledge that can save lives, and formal procedures would prevent me from using that knowledge, I'll choose to save lives every time." The silence that followed her statement was profound, filled with the weight of principles and precedents that would shape not only Elena's future, but the future of how such situations were handled throughout the industry. She had drawn a line in the sand, choosing moral clarity over political expedience. Dr. Vega was the first to break the silence, her analytical mind processing the implications of Elena's declaration. "The question becomes whether we can develop formal procedures that incorporate your specialized knowledge while maintaining appropriate command structure." Captain Mendoza looked surprised by this suggestion, his focus shifting from punishment to problem-solving. "What are you proposing, Doctor?" "I'm proposing that we learn from this incident rather than simply punishing it. If First Officer Vasquez possesses knowledge that could prevent future accidents, perhaps we should be incorporating that knowledge into our training programs rather than suppressing it." Elena felt a surge of unexpected hope as the conversation began to shift toward constructive solutions. Dr. Vega's reputation for thorough analysis was legendary, and her support could change the entire trajectory of the proceedings. Captain Foster nodded thoughtfully, adding his voice to the evolving discussion. Mountain flying is becoming more common as airlines expand their routes. If we have a pilot with specialized expertise in these conditions, it makes sense to leverage that knowledge rather than ignore it. The union representative remained cautious, but seemed open to alternative approaches. Any changes would need to be carefully structured to maintain appropriate authority relationships while allowing for specialized input. Elena sensed that the meeting had reached a crucial turning point, shifting from a disciplinary hearing toward a more collaborative discussion of how to improve safety and training. She chose her next words carefully, understanding that this might be her only opportunity to influence the outcome. "I'd like to propose something," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to suggest. "Instead of focusing on punishment for procedural violations, what if we developed a supplemental training program for mountain flying? I could work with experienced instructors to create curriculum that prepares pilots for the kind of extreme conditions we encountered." Captain Mendoza's expression remained skeptical, but Elena could see that he was at least considering the possibility. Such a program would need extensive development and approval. It would require significant resources and regulatory review. "The alternative," Elena replied quietly, "is waiting for the next accident to happen when a crew encounters conditions they weren't trained to handle. How many lives is that worth?" Dr. Vega gathered her papers and closed her folder, her decision apparently made. "I'm going to recommend that we suspend any disciplinary action pending development of a comprehensive mountain flying training program. First Officer Vasquez will lead the development effort, working with qualified instructors and safety experts." Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the unexpected turn of events. She had avoided punishment, but she had also been handed a massive responsibility that would determine whether her actions would be viewed as heroic innovation or dangerous precedent. Captain Foster extended his hand across the table, his smile genuine and warm. "Congratulations, Elena. You just volunteered yourself for the most challenging assignment of your career." As the meeting concluded and the participants filed out of the conference room, Elena remained seated for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had walked into the building expecting to defend her career, but she was leaving with an opportunity to revolutionize how pilots were trained for extreme conditions. The next few months would test her abilities in ways she had never imagined. She would need to develop curriculum, coordinate with regulators, and prove that her unconventional techniques could be safely integrated into standard training programs. The success or failure of this effort would determine not only her own future but the future of mountain flying safety throughout the industry. But Elena felt ready for the challenge, energized by the opportunity to transform a moment of crisis into lasting improvement for aviation safety. She had proven herself in the cockpit over the Andes, demonstrating that experience and adaptive thinking could overcome the most extreme conditions. Now she would have the chance to share that knowledge with others, ensuring that future pilots would be better prepared for the challenges that mountains could present. As she walked out of the building and into the bright Lima sunshine, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a military pilot, whose unconventional background was seen as a liability in the structured world of commercial aviation. Through a combination of courage, skill, and the willingness to act when action was necessary, she had transformed that liability into one of her greatest assets. The phone call from Captain Rodriguez came that evening, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and professional respect that had been absent during their flight together. He had heard about the outcome of the meeting and wanted to express his support for the training program Elena would be developing. "You saved my career, as well as everyone's lives," he said simply. "I want to be the first person to volunteer for your mountain flying course." Elena smiled, recognizing that Rodriguez's attitude had been fundamentally changed by their experience over the Andes. He had learned the same lesson that every pilot eventually discovered, that flying was a constant education, and the most dangerous attitude was the belief that you already knew everything you needed to know. Within 6 months, Elena's mountain flying program had been approved by regulators and adopted by airlines throughout South America. Pilots from around the world came to Lima to learn the techniques that had saved Flight AV 247, studying the principles of working with atmospheric phenomena rather than fighting against them. Elena found herself in demand as an instructor and consultant, her reputation spreading throughout the aviation community as someone who possessed rare knowledge and the courage to use it when lives depended on decisive action. She was promoted to captain ahead of schedule, recognized not only for her technical expertise, but for her leadership qualities and commitment to safety. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the grandmother who had been traveling to meet her new grandchild on that terrifying flight, sent Elena a photograph of herself holding the baby she had been able to meet, because Elena had refused to let protocol override the need to save lives. The photograph sat on Elena's desk in her new office at the airline's training center, a daily reminder that aviation was ultimately about people rather than procedures, about human lives that depended on the skill and judgment of those trusted to carry them safely through the sky. Elena Vasquez had started her career as an invisible first officer, whose unconventional background was seen as a liability. Through courage, competence, and the willingness to act when action was necessary, she had become one of the most respected pilots in South American aviation. Her techniques were now taught to pilots around the world, and her name had become synonymous with the principle that safety should always take precedence over protocol. The mountains that had once threatened to claim her aircraft had instead become the forge in which her reputation was shaped. She had learned to read their moods and work with their power, transforming from someone who fought the elements into someone who understood them well enough to make them her allies. Years later, when young pilots asked Elena about the secret to successful mountain flying, her answer was always the same: respect the mountains, understand your aircraft, and never be afraid to act when lives depend on your decision. The rules and procedures were important, but they were tools to be used wisely rather than chains to bind a pilot's judgment when crisis demanded innovation. Elena's story became legendary among aviators, passed down through generations of pilots as an example of what could be achieved when knowledge, courage, and the willingness to challenge convention came together at the moment when they were needed most. She had proven that sometimes the most important thing a pilot could do was refuse to let someone else crash the airplane, regardless of who held the official authority to make that decision. The conference room at the International Civil Aviation Organization headquarters in Montreal buzzed with quiet conversation as delegates from 43 nations took their seats around the massive oval table. Elena sat near the middle of the group, her captain's uniform bearing the insignia of her airline and the special medallion that marked her as a certified mountain flying instructor. 3 years had passed since her emergency over the Andes, and the ripple effects of that single flight were still spreading throughout the global aviation community. Dr. James Patterson, the ICAO Secretary General, called the assembly to order with the gravity befitting such a gathering. This was the International Mountain Flying Safety Summit, the first of its kind, convened specifically to address the growing number of incidents involving commercial aircraft in mountainous terrain. Elena's presence as a keynote speaker represented a remarkable transformation from the forgotten first officer who had once sat silently in briefing rooms. The statistics that Dr. Patterson presented painted a sobering picture of aviation's expanding challenge with mountain operations. Commercial airlines were increasingly flying routes through the world's major mountain ranges, as global air traffic continued to grow and new destinations became economically viable. The Himalayas, the Rockies, the Alps, the Andes, all were seeing increased commercial traffic, and with it, an alarming rise in incidents related to mountain flying hazards. Elena listened as case after case was presented, each one a variation on themes she knew intimately. Pilots trained in conventional aviation encountering conditions that their simulators had never replicated, weather phenomena that defied standard meteorological predictions, terrain effects that transformed routine flights into desperate struggles for survival. She recognized her own story in each incident, the pattern of trained professionals finding themselves inadequate to handle the unique demands of mountain aviation. When her turn came to address the assembly, Elena rose with the confidence of someone who had not only survived the worst that mountains could offer, but had transformed that survival into systematic knowledge that could benefit others. Her presentation began with the satellite image of the Andes range where her own crisis had occurred, the jagged peaks looking deceptively peaceful from space. She spoke without notes, her words carrying the authority of lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. She described the atmospheric dynamics that turned mountains into invisible killers, the way terrain could channel and amplify weather patterns in ways that traditional forecasting methods often missed. More importantly, she explained how pilots could learn to read these conditions and work with them rather than against them. The audience was captivated by her practical approach to problems that had seemed intractable. Elena's techniques weren't complex theoretical constructs, but simple, proven methods that any competent pilot could learn and apply. She demonstrated how to recognize the early signs of mountain wave activity, how to use terrain features as navigation aids when electronic systems failed, and how to make the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Captain Hans Müller from Lufthansa raised his hand during the question period. Captain Vasquez, your techniques seem to require pilots to make decisions that contradict their basic training. How do we implement such methods without creating confusion or undermining established procedures? Elena had wrestled with this question throughout the development of her training program. The challenge wasn't just teaching new techniques, but helping pilots understand when and how to apply them without abandoning the systematic approaches that made commercial aviation safe. Captain Müller, the key is understanding that mountain flying is a specialized discipline, like instrument flying or formation flying. We don't expect every pilot to be an expert in every type of flying, but we do expect them to recognize when they're entering conditions that require specialized knowledge. She clicked to the next slide, showing a decision tree that helped pilots assess when mountain-specific techniques might be necessary. The flowchart was elegantly simple, guiding pilots through a series of questions about weather conditions, terrain features, and aircraft performance that would indicate when conventional procedures might be insufficient. The goal isn't to replace standard procedures, but to supplement them when conditions exceed their design parameters. A pilot flying through the Rocky Mountains in clear weather would use standard techniques. But the same pilot encountering severe mountain wave activity would need additional tools to safely navigate the situation. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Civil Aviation Authority of China leaned forward in her seat. Captain Vasquez, implementing such training globally, would require enormous resources and coordination between multiple regulatory bodies. How do you propose we achieve standardization across different aviation systems? Elena had anticipated this question as well. The political and bureaucratic challenges of implementing new training standards were often more daunting than the technical challenges of developing the training itself. But her experience had taught her that change was possible when the need was clearly demonstrated, and the solutions were practical. Dr. Chen, I believe we start with a pilot program involving airlines that regularly operate in mountainous terrain. We develop standardized curriculum, train instructors, and document results. Once we can demonstrate improved safety outcomes, the business case for broader implementation becomes compelling. The discussion that followed was animated and wide-ranging, touching on everything from simulator requirements to regulatory harmonization. Elena found herself at the center of debates about pilot training philosophy, the role of technology in aviation safety, and the balance between standardization and specialized knowledge. Captain Pierre Dubois from Air France posed a particularly challenging question. Captain Vasquez, your approach seems to emphasize pilot judgment and adaptability over systematic procedures. How do we ensure safety when we're essentially asking pilots to improvise in critical situations? Elena paused before answering, recognizing that this question went to the heart of a fundamental tension in modern aviation. The industry had achieved remarkable safety improvements through standardization and systematic procedures. But those same systematic approaches could become limitations when conditions exceeded their design parameters. Captain Dubois, I'm not advocating improvisation. I'm advocating for a deeper understanding of the fundamental principles that make flight possible. When a pilot truly understands why an aircraft behaves the way it does, they can apply that knowledge systematically, even in situations they've never encountered before. She walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room and drew a simple diagram showing airflow over a mountain ridge. This is basic aerodynamics, but it's also the foundation for understanding mountain wave phenomena. A pilot who understands these principles can recognize and respond to mountain wave conditions even if they've never encountered them before. The diagram grew more complex as Elena added wind patterns, pressure variations, and turbulence zones. But the underlying principles remained simple and logical, building on knowledge that every pilot already possessed. Her approach wasn't about teaching completely new concepts, but about connecting existing knowledge in ways that reveal deeper understanding. Dr. Patterson called for a brief recess, and Elena found herself surrounded by delegates eager to continue the discussion. Pilots shared their own experiences with challenging mountain conditions, while safety officials asked detailed questions about implementation timelines and training requirements. Captain Lisa Williams from British Airways approached Elena with a story that exemplified the global nature of the challenges they were discussing. 6 months ago, one of our crews encountered severe turbulence over the Himalayas during a flight to Delhi. They followed standard procedures, but the conditions were unlike anything in their training. They managed to recover, but barely. If they had known your techniques, the situation would have been much more manageable. Elena nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why we need to move beyond reactive training to proactive preparation. We can't wait for pilots to learn these techniques through near disasters. We need to give them the tools before they need them. When the session resumed, Dr. Patterson announced that ICAO would be forming a working group to develop international standards for mountain flying training. Elena would chair the group, working with experts from around the world to create curriculum that could be adapted to different regulatory environments and operational requirements. The appointment represented the culmination of Elena's transformation from invisible first officer to recognized expert, but it also marked the beginning of an even greater challenge. Developing training standards that could be implemented globally would require diplomacy, technical expertise, and the kind of systematic thinking that Elena had learned through her unique career path. Over the following months, Elena found herself traveling constantly, visiting airlines and training facilities around the world. In Denver, she worked with United Airlines pilots who flew daily through the Rocky Mountains. In Zurich, she consulted with Swiss International Airlines on their alpine operations. In Nepal, she studied the extreme conditions that faced pilots flying into airports like Lukla, where margins for error were measured in feet rather than miles. Each location taught her something new about the challenges of mountain flying and the cultural differences that affected how pilots approached those challenges. American pilots tended to rely heavily on technology and systematic procedures. European pilots emphasized precision and adherence to established protocols. Asian pilots often demonstrated remarkable adaptability, but sometimes lacked access to the most current training resources. Elena's role was to find common ground between these different approaches, identifying universal principles that could be applied regardless of cultural background or regulatory environment. She discovered that the fundamental challenges were remarkably consistent around the world, even when the specific terrain and weather patterns varied dramatically. The breakthrough came during a training session in Santiago, Chile, where Elena was working with LATAM Airlines pilots who flew regularly through the Andes. One of the pilots, Captain Roberto Silva, had encountered conditions remarkably similar to those Elena had faced during her emergency flight years earlier. "I did exactly what you would have done," Silva explained after a simulator session, turned left, descended slightly, used the mountain's own airflow to escape the downdraft. "But I learned that technique from studying your incident reports, not from any formal training program." Elena realized that her techniques were already spreading informally through the pilot community, passed along through conversations and shared experiences rather than systematic instruction. Pilots were teaching themselves the principles she had developed, but without the structured approach that would ensure consistency and safety. This informal dissemination of knowledge was both encouraging and concerning. It showed that pilots recognized the value of her methods and were eager to learn them, but it also highlighted the risks of allowing critical safety techniques to spread without proper oversight and standardization. Elena accelerated her work on the ICAO standards, understanding that formal programs were needed to replace the informal knowledge transfer that was already occurring. She assembled a team of experts from around the world, each bringing unique perspectives on mountain flying challenges in their regions. Dr. Michael Zhang from the Civil Aviation Administration of China contributed expertise on high-altitude operations and the physiological challenges that affected pilot performance in thin air. Captain Anna Petrov from Aeroflot shared knowledge of flying in extreme cold conditions where standard procedures often proved inadequate. Captain Ahmed Hassan from Royal Jordanian Airlines provided insights into desert mountain flying, where heat and terrain combined to create unique atmospheric conditions. The team worked intensively for 8 months, developing curriculum that addressed not just the technical aspects of mountain flying, but also the decision-making processes that determined when specialized techniques were necessary. They created simulator scenarios that replicated the most challenging conditions pilots might encounter, from the violent downdrafts of the Andes to the unpredictable wind patterns of the Himalayas. Elena insisted that the training program include extensive decision-making components, recognizing that technical knowledge was useless without the judgment to apply it appropriately. Pilots learned not just how to execute escape maneuvers, but how to recognize when such maneuvers were necessary and when conventional procedures would be sufficient. The first formal implementation of the program took place at Elena's own airline, where she could oversee every aspect of the training and gather detailed feedback on its effectiveness. The results exceeded even her optimistic expectations. Pilots who completed the program demonstrated measurably improved performance in mountain flying scenarios, with significantly reduced incident rates during actual operations. More importantly, the pilots themselves reported increased confidence and situational awareness when flying in mountainous terrain. They felt prepared for conditions that had previously seemed overwhelming, equipped with tools and knowledge that transformed mysterious atmospheric phenomena into manageable challenges. News of the program's success spread rapidly through the aviation community. Airlines from around the world began requesting access to the training materials and instructor certification programs. Regulatory authorities started incorporating mountain flying requirements into their pilot licensing standards. Aircraft manufacturers began designing simulator software that could replicate the atmospheric conditions that Elena's program addressed. Elena found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her original goal of improving mountain flying safety. Her work had sparked a broader conversation about the role of specialized knowledge in aviation training and the importance of preparing pilots for conditions that exceeded standard operating parameters. The recognition came in many forms, from technical awards to speaking invitations at major aviation conferences. But for Elena, the most meaningful recognition came in the form of incident reports that didn't happen, flights that continued safely because pilots had the knowledge and confidence to handle challenging conditions appropriately. Captain Rodriguez, her former captain from the Quito flight, became one of her most effective advocates. He had completed her training program among the first group of pilots, and had subsequently used the techniques during his own emergency situation over the Colombian Andes. His endorsement carried particular weight because he could speak from personal experience about both the limitations of conventional training and the effectiveness of Elena's methods. As Elena stood before another international gathering of aviation professionals, this time in Geneva at the World Aviation Safety Summit, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had evolved from a pilot whose knowledge was dismissed as irrelevant to a leader whose expertise was shaping global aviation standards. Her presentation to the Geneva Assembly focused on the broader implications of her work, the lessons that extended beyond mountain flying to other specialized areas of aviation. She spoke about the importance of preserving institutional knowledge, the need to balance standardization with adaptability, and the critical role that individual expertise played in advancing collective safety. The audience listened with rapt attention as Elena described how her unconventional background had provided insights that conventional training had missed. She emphasized that diversity of experience wasn't just about fairness or representation, but about safety and capability. Different backgrounds brought different perspectives, and those perspectives could reveal solutions to problems that seemed intractable to more conventional approaches. Elena's story had become larger than mountain flying, larger even than aviation safety. It had become a testament to the value of preserving and applying specialized knowledge, the importance of challenging conventional wisdom when evidence suggested better approaches, and the potential for individual initiative to create positive change on a global scale. As she concluded her presentation, Elena looked out over an audience that included some of the most influential figures in international aviation. These were people who made decisions that affected millions of passengers and thousands of pilots around the world. And they were listening to her, the former first officer whose expertise had once been dismissed, with the respect and attention that her knowledge and achievements had earned. The transformation was complete, but Elena understood that her work was far from finished. Aviation would continue to evolve, new challenges would emerge, and future pilots would need the tools and knowledge to handle whatever conditions they might encounter. Her legacy would be measured not just by the lives saved through her techniques, but by the culture of continuous learning and improvement that her example had helped establish. Elena Vasquez had proven that knowledge and courage could overcome institutional resistance, that individual expertise could drive systemic change, and that the most important innovations often came from the most unexpected sources. Her journey from invisible first officer to global aviation leader was a reminder that expertise could be found in unlikely places, and that the most valuable knowledge was often possessed by those who had been overlooked or underestimated. The mountains that had once threatened to claim her life had instead become the foundation for a career that would influence aviation safety for generations to come. And Elena continued to fly, still learning, still teaching, still proving that the sky held secrets that could only be unlocked by those brave enough to challenge what everyone else accepted as impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.